morning. I'm Lainey and I'm the center manager for the Michigan Youth Violence Prevention Center. We're a CDC-funded center that's focused on building the evidence base for youth gun violence prevention. And I'm so grateful and excited to welcome Greg today as the first speaker in our four-part series, Charting the Path Forward, Engaging Our Science, Policy, and Practice to Reduce Gun Violence Disparities. As you know, gun violence disparities widened during the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's more critical than ever that we're collaborating across practitioners, policymakers, and scientists to find interdisciplinary solutions. And so I'm really grateful to and excited to welcome Greg. We're hosting this series in partnership with the University of Michigan's Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention, the Public Health Ideas Initiative, and the Injury Prevention Center. So now I want to introduce Greg. Greg is a gun violence survivor, political strategist, and accomplished issue advocate. He's been a leader in the movement to end gun violence for over 10 years. And as the executive director of the Community Justice Action Fund, he played a major role in passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year. I'm excited to learn more about Greg's work that's focused on centering the leadership and voices of communities of color in prevention and policy change. And for the researchers in the room, I'm also selfishly interested in learning how we can collaborate more effectively with policymakers so that our science can be used to its fullest potential. And before we get started, I just want to let you know that we'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please save your questions until the end. And at that point, you can raise your virtual hand or your real hand. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. You can also put your questions in the chat. So Greg, thank you so much for being here, and I'll give you the floor.
Sounds good. Good morning, everybody. Let's see. We're virtual, so I'm gonna try my best to interact. I see a whole room full of folks over there. Good morning, y'all. How y'all doing? And my fellow Zoomers, good to see y'all too. So I'm Greg Jackson, again, the executive director for Community Justice Action Fund. Just a little bit about myself. I was that nerdy political kid in high school who thought, everyone could be Malcolm X, right? And I went off to college with that same energy. After college, I moved to DC, like a lot of folks do, to get involved with politics, and got on the campaign trail for Obama during his first election, and wound up in Charleston, South Carolina during the primary when folks could barely pronounce his name. And then back then, I really learned the power of folks using their voice and using their vote to bring about change, because at that point in his career, very little people knew him, but there was also very rural, poor Black folks, frankly, who were making those decisions of who's going to lead our country. And that was really, really inspiring to see folks like me that maybe didn't have the resources that you would think when you look at the political process, but having so much power by just using their voice. So I got addicted to politics way back then, and working my way through politics. I wound up managing over 40 campaigns in my career, which was all exciting, and wound up coming back to DC to work in Capitol Hill, helping with a lot of congressional races. It was during that time that I learned firsthand how different politics is to addressing issues. In April of 2013, while I was working for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, a few of my friends were walking home late one night and literally took a wrong turn and wound up in the middle of a shootout. And I was shot. And the bullet that hit me hit two arteries, and I nearly bled to death that night. And what was really traumatizing about that moment were two big things. One was when I arrived at the hospital, I wasn't met with nurses and doctors and family. I was met with law enforcement, and I had to go through 3 rounds of interrogation before I could go into surgery. And mind you, I'm bleeding to death. So that was really scary. And my surgeon said I only had about 30 minutes left to live after being shot, and that I nearly died through this process of being interrogated, which was scary in its own right. And then the second big thing was when I did make it through my first surgery, I remember turning on CNN and watching members of Congress dismiss this issue. I was shot 3 days after the Senate failed to pass the Brady background check bill in light of the Newtown shooting. And so it was really disheartening to watch the same leaders that I worked for. A lot of them I helped elect, and some of them I thought were friends, some of which you even called me, while I was in the hospital. go on TV and dismiss this as a priority issue. And so that's what really sparked my commitment to this issue, not only my own survival, but recognizing that in America, we have a crime first, health second approach to gun violence, and that too many politicians have frankly been off the hook of addressing this issue despite how bad it was even back then. So I do have a couple slides. I know this is a learning session, but I don't want to teach you all to death or do too much. So give me a second, I'm gonna pull them up. And while I'm doing, I can keep kind of talking while I'm rolling. But so, you know, when I got out the hospital, I spent about 6 months in recovery. I went through 6 different surgeries. But through that time, I spent a lot of time learning about the issue beyond my experience, and learning a little bit about what's being done and what's not being done. And so I'll share with you kind of what we've learned and what we've done since then. And one last piece, when I was able to get back on my feet, I discovered this amazing organization, Community Justice Action Fund, and joined the board and eventually joined the staff, and now serve as the executive director of Community Justice. So Community Justice, we work to end gun violence in Black and Brown communities, but we focus on empowering those most impacted to tell their story, to build political power, and to connect to resources as well as advance policy. It's a quick snapshot of our team. We actually are national in organization, and we're the only Black and survivor-led national gun violence prevention organization. So we do a lot of work in Washington with the White House. We actually was at an event yesterday with the White House. We do a lot of work in Capitol Hill, but then we also have priority states where we focus on city level and state level policy change. So this is a quick snapshot of our states. Michigan is one of them. So, you know, between my work and the research of our team, there was a lot that we discovered about this crisis. Some of this may be obvious to you, and you may hear about this a lot, but, you know, every year over 100,000 people are shot or killed. Last year, 48,000 lives were lost. And for me, that means, you know, nearly 1 million, actually over 1 million people have been shot since I was shot in April 2013. We've also seen that there were huge spikes since the pandemic, which your facilitator spoke about a little bit earlier, Lainey. But to be specific, there was a 45% increase in gun homicides, 172% increase in teen homicides, and even a 10% increase in gun suicides. And while suicides still make up around 50 to 60% of the deaths from gun violence, we're seeing the highest surge in homicides. The other thing about homicides, we're also noticing that homicides is 80% Black or brown folks, and I think it's around 52% are actually Black men. Gun violence has become the number one cause of premature death for all youth, but also Black men, which is not talked a lot about in the media. And for Black youth, it's been the number one cause of premature death since 2006. So this is not a new epidemic for the Black community, but it does appear to be a new crisis for America as a whole. There's also a real fiscal cost. And so every year right now, our largest estimate is that we're losing $557 billion when you look at court fees, hospital fees, impacts on income, cost of living, et cetera. But a couple other things that I think most folks are not aware of. There's also a huge increase in police violence and what's quote unquote justified violence. So every state that has stand your ground laws or laws that encourage the use of lethal force are starting to see a huge spike in what's considered justified. We also, as I shared earlier, while Black men only make up 6% of the population, they're now 52% of all homicides. And there's also a huge spike growing in violence against women and the LGBTQ plus community that's being overlooked. In fact, 100,000 Black women are reported murdered or missing every year. And we believe there's a lot of data that intersects there with gun violence that we just don't have, and that the crisis amongst Black women is much higher. But here's the other big thing. This was the big aha for us and for our work is that, you know, when we look at why the homicides are happening, when you look at the media, I guarantee if you look at the news this morning or tonight, you're going to see, Black men shot, and there's going to be yellow tape and red and blue lights, right? Which kind of reinforces that a crime happened. And yes, a crime happened with the shooting, but what we learned is that 70% of homicides in the Black community are not connected to another felony crime. So they're not connected to robberies or gang activity or drugs. You know, a lot of it is interpersonal conflict between people who know each other about something that's not a felony activity. So it's either a disagreement, something domestic, a domestic dispute, maybe a relationship issue, but it's not this, gang and drugs narrative that we're seeing in the media every day. In fact, 89% of homicides in the Black community are not connected to gang activity. And that's huge. And I think what that reminds us as advocates is that this is not a crime crisis, because even if we did the crime side of the work perfectly, we would only be able to address 30% of the homicides. This is more so a crisis, a public health crisis. And so we started to dig a little deeper. I'll share just kind of what we found or some big themes that we found and have been advocating around. What we actually found is that the biggest indicator of whether someone's going to act out violently in the future is, have they been traumatized by gun violence? Have they personally been injured? Have they lost someone close to them? Have they been exposed to an act of gun violence? Have family or peers been impacted directly? Or did they know someone and that homicide was never closed? But it's that exposure to violence, and some activists and academics will even talk about it as a disease, that exposure to violence is what reinforces or increases their likelihood of harming someone else. We also know that there are real risk factors that increase the likelihood of firearms to be used in a conflict. Number one being just access to the firearm, but it's not just that. It's also our failing criminal justice system, access to mental health care, and really the disruption of our family and social support systems. And then lastly, there are real root causes that increase these risk factors and concentrate this trauma. And when we think about that, some big things are living conditions, economic opportunity, education disparities, mass incarceration, overall wellness. All of these root causes really fuel and increase the risk factors, but also tend to concentrate those who have been impacted by gun violence. So what do we do with that? So at Community Justice, we identified about 15 strategies so far. There's more than this, obviously, but about 15 things that we can do to start to address this crisis of violence. And guess what? It's not just ban assault weapons, right? A lot of what we can do can save lives through behavioral change and working with those who are most impacted or most at risk. So the first big step is intervention, investing in strategies that help intervene the cycle of, oh, sorry, I got a little text message. And it popped up on my screen. Hopefully I didn't see that. All right, good. Yeah, someone was like, you owe me this, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, all right, it's work day. So the first big thing is intervention. And so we know that there are strategies that can disrupt the cycle of violence and frankly, save lives today. The number one thing that we can do in that bucket is strengthen our survivor and victim services. We know that 50% of people who have been shot, unfortunately, will be shot again, will shoot someone else, or be killed by a future act of gun violence. And so if we just improve the resources for those who have been impacted, we can greatly reduce the likelihood of retaliation. And frankly, there's close to nothing out there for victims of gun violence. In New York, for example, the state of New York, there's one program to provide reimbursement after you've been shot or injured. And it's up to $20,000 to reimburse you for medical fees. And we found that only 4% of victims even applied for the funds. So folks and that's all they have, right? And so when you think about someone who's shot versus other forms of trauma, there's very little that exists out there. The second thing is community violence intervention, or some folks call this really more street outreach work, but tactics that actually work in communities and help de-escalate conflicts before they become fatal. Again, 70% are not connected to other felonies. So typically it's a disagreement, it's an argument, it's an ongoing feud between individuals, many of which can be de-escalated and frankly resolved with some smart de-escalation tactics, trauma-informed approaches. And what we've seen in certain cities, they've been able to reduce violence upwards of 50% by just having folks in the communities that are de-escalating and working through these conflicts with those who are at odds. There's also hospital-based violence intervention that does the similar work, but focuses on when someone enters the hospital, how do you help them through that fragile moment and reduce their likelihood of retaliating, or their family retaliating, or their friends who are in the hospital retaliating, but recognizing that the hospital is a natural kind of convener of those who've been most traumatized by an incident. Two other intervention tactics are behavioral therapy programs like Advanced Peace that will work with those who have a history of violent behavior, maybe not criminal behavior, but someone that maybe gotten kicked out of school for fighting too much, someone who's a known, violent individual in the community. These programs work with those who are most at risk and help them through really small cognitive behavioral shifts to help change behavior and hopefully help them lead a more healthy life. I was able to be a part of one of these programs here in Washington, D.C. And it was transformational to watch those who had a very, very rough history turn around and then, get jobs and apartments and, really starting to build for their family and for themselves with just a little bit of therapeutic support to help them navigate through their emotional issues or instability. And then lastly, group violence intervention, which is really focused on large groups that we know are involved in violent activity. I think this does get back to that 11% that are involved with gang activity. But these programs provide wraparound services for those of an entire group and really works that entire group to either support them or to hold them accountable, frankly, when something happens. So I'm not going to go through all 15 of these because that's a whole TED Talk, but this first layer up top is really some of those intervention tactics that we have seen work. There's a ton of resources and evidence around, but we also recognized are either non-existent or are barely functioning in most cities due to lack of resources. There are also strategies to combat the risk factors that we spoke of, and again, some of the larger systemic issues that revolve around the root causes of violence that we know all play into this approach. The overwhelming thing, though, that we've been telling and pushing our elected officials is that this is a public health crisis, so we need to take a public health approach. And if you look at every other public health approach in America, it's not just regulations around access. It includes resources for behavioral change. It includes research. It includes resources for recovery of those impacted. I mean, we just went through it. Think about COVID, right? We didn't just say no one can ever go outside again. That was not the answer. The answer was we need to stay inside for a little while. We got to wear masks. We got to take these shots. We got to get this booster. We got to social distance. It was an entire strategy put in place to help eradicate that crisis. But for whatever reason with gun violence, the only approach we've seen has been criminal responses, and then some of these more gun access regulation responses, but really forgetting the behavioral side and the resources needed for those who have been traumatized. So a lot of what we've been doing has been pushing the movement and pushing our leaders to think about this in a more comprehensive way. All right, that's a lot of preaching. I will just say some big priorities for us because there's a lot of work that can be done. We decided to focus first and foremost on budget advocacy, recognizing that there's a huge impact on our financial being in this country from the issue of gun violence, but also some of these life-saving strategies don't have the resources they need. So we focused on first, how do we increase funding for community violence intervention and prevention programs? How do we increase funding and resources for youth violence intervention and prevention programs? How do we increase resources for research? Because right now, gun violence of the top 30 causes of death, this is the least researched. It's actually laughable. Raise your hand if you know what sepsis is. Okay, 3 of y'all. I didn't know what it was. Oh, 6. Well, I didn't know that one. I thought maybe I have to look up another curveball. But anyway, sepsis gets about 3 times the research dollars that gun violence does. And again, half of y'all don't even know what it means. It's nowhere near the top 30 causes of death. Of course, it's a tragedy for anyone losing their life. But it's a good example of how we're pouring millions and millions of dollars into other forms of research around other crises. But with gun violence, I think we capped out at about $100 million federally which is laughable when you look at how much research has gone into opioids, automobile crashes, sepsis. And so that's a huge thing we've been pushing for. And then on the other side of the spectrum is we've also been focused on how do we advance policy changes that create more resources and more strategies to address violence. And again, not just the simple, let's ban the weapons, let's implement permitting systems, but how do we think about the resources that are needed to help address behavior and support those most impacted? And so a couple key things we've been fighting for is the creation of offices of violence prevention across the country. These are entities that work to make sure that all of government is working together to address violence, not just law enforcement. So they'll be, that's the type of program that would oversee your housing strategy for those impacted, your economic strategy. And also we've seen that these offices have been great to help build out and resource programs across the government. The creation of task forces or research focused specifically on how violence is impacting Black women, recognizing that right now there are just too many untold stories to inform the strategies. And so we've been pushing to make that a priority. We have a bill in 2 states and then 1 federal bill for that. So three opportunities there. And then the creation of emergency responses protocols. One huge thing that we noticed is that when there are acts of mass violence, coming back to the support for survivors, what we recognize is that, think about this year, for example, there have been more mass shootings in America than there have been days in a year, right? But I guarantee that most of us only know about 10, or 12 of those, which is actually a lot, by the way. We shouldn't even know that many, right? Like when I was in high school, we only heard about 1 every 3 years, right? But there are a lot of these incidents, and a big problem that we noticed is that the response and the support for those who have been impacted in the communities was really dependent on the media coverage, right? There was no protocol. So the same day that the shooting happened in Nashville, Tennessee, there was a shooting in Memphis. There was more tragic, but no one heard about it, right? No one talked about it. And what we're learning is that it's not, unfortunately, the media doesn't gravitate to where the most pain is. They gravitate to what's most sensational or what can emotionally draw folks. But that shouldn't be deciding what type of resources and support go to those who have been harmed. And so a big thing we've been pushing for and achieved, frankly, was the creation of an emergency response protocol so that the government operates and responds to crises based on criteria that's not just the public opinion or media interest. And so we were really pumped about a month ago. Biden announced that they have created this protocol through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And now the same way if a tornado hits when a mass shooting happens or a mass casualty from gun violence happens, there are different steps that they take to provide resources and support independent of the media. And then the last big thing as far as policy change is really increasing access to victim services and compensation. So in New York, for example, we did get a big bill passed to reform their violence prevention. Their victim services funds and access to those resources, hoping to increase that number from 4%. All right, I thought I was throwing a whole bunch of slides at y'all. Let me see. I got 2 more, and I'm gonna shut up. So that's a lot of what we've learned, a lot of what we've seen, and some of the big policy priorities that we've been focused on. As far as how we get it done, we have our work is kind of structured in 4 big buckets, and I'll be pretty quick about this. But we realize that it's not enough just to fight for policy. You also have to tell the story and own the narrative, because if you're not fighting for the narrative, if you're not owning and influencing the narrative, then public opinion will skew with that narrative and your policy will be unraveled. And I learned this back in my old Obama campaign days when I met an old congressman. He had spent 30 years of his life trying to pass one bill around credit card reform. He got it done. It was all great. The media blew up. The next session, they wiped it off they repealed it. And this was 30 years of his life. And it was, and what he shared with me was that the media kind of ran with it a different direction than what the bill really meant. And he couldn't do anything about it. And so the media really unraveled the story of what his bill could do and how it could help people. And so we learn from that. And I think a lot of activists across the movement learn from that. So we're focusing on how do we make sure that the media is being held accountable. We actually have an annual media bias report that's dropping this fall that shows how they're reporting crises in different communities and how does this look different if it's a Black community or a white community. We also do a ton of traditional media. We were in the news 2,234 times last year. So we're doing a lot of work to make sure our message is front and center. And then, we're starting to get bigger into social media and different things like that. And we have some celebrity influencers and folks who are helping to carry our message here as we move forward. Second, we do a ton of organizing work because you can't change policy by yourself or just being smart. You gotta build an army. And the best way to do that is to mobilize those who have been most impacted. And so we have state-based coalitions, we have national coalitions, we have about 600 organizations across the country that are in partnership with us, as well as corporations like GoFundMe, Meta, so on and so on. And then we also are working with policymakers who are passionate about this issue all across the country. And those policymakers are pretty exciting. Folks like Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Stephen Horsford, and then even Congressman Maxwell Frost and some up and coming folks. And then the last two big pieces is we advocate. And so we do that through our advocacy campaigns, endorsing bills that align with our push, hosting briefings to educate politicians and their staff, but also hosting lobby days to go to Congress and talk to those members directly about what we want to see done. And the last big piece of our approach is we do our best to make sure that when we do fight to achieve resources, that we're connecting those resources with the communities and trying to be a bridge between the resources in government and the communities on the ground. All right, last slide. This is it. I just want to share a couple of big things we've accomplished so far. We were a big part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It was the first bill passed in 30 years on gun violence. We specifically focused on the more resource side of it. So the community violence intervention piece, the funding for suicide prevention, and then also the areas around gun trafficking. So we're very proud of that. We also have been fighting hard for funding, as I shared earlier. When we started on this push in 2019, there was only $16 million federally for these strategies. Now there's around $14.2 billion that these programs are eligible for. So, moving from millies to billies, right? That's a big deal as far as opening the doors for folks. And now our work is making sure that organizations gain access to these dollars, now that there's a doorway for them to get in. And we testified before Congress last year, which was really exciting. As far as organizing, we have 12 large coalitions, 31 policymakers for peace in our network. And we're just most proud of being able to support the advocates and survivors from Buffalo and Uvalde. If you haven't been tracking what they've been doing, it's really, really inspiring. But I encourage you to watch how aggressive and active those groups of survivors have been in advancing policy. And it's been great. We've been behind the curtain with them through all that work. I talked about the media, but then the last thing, which is pretty cool, is we last year launched our first City Violence Prevention Index report. And so essentially we looked at the top 50 cities most impacted by violence. And in those cities, we assessed what strategies here do they have. And we went way more in depth, but we looked at what strategies are they implementing and resourcing, and what does their approach to addressing gun violence look like at the city level beyond their police strategies. And sadly, a lot of cities are not doing well. Even the ones that say they're doing well, when you look at their policy and resources, they're falling way short. But it was a really cool project. It was covered by the USA Today. And a lot of mayors have really stepped up, frankly, since we kind of shined a light on their shortcomings. So those are all my slides. I'm going to pause there. So I won't preach at y'all all day long and see if there are any questions or thoughts. But I will just say, just overall, the big thing that we are focused on is really pushing for this comprehensive approach to gun violence and recognizing that the behavioral change side of the work, or the demand side of the work, some people use like the sublime demand concept, it requires resources and it requires investing in the communities who are most impacted, and not just not just prescribing solutions, not just focused on gun access, but how do we strengthen the resources they need and we need, frankly, to help save lives in our communities. And that's a different style of advocacy that I think we bring this a little fresh to the movement. So anyway, I'll pause there and answer some questions.